911.
Cardiac arrest.
25-0.
We have a working fire.
Hold traffic, shots fired.
2 or 3 years, shelved it. Tell me how American Sirens, came to be in its final form, because it is one of the most inspiring reads. It does not read like, a biography. It does not read. It is very well engaging. And tell me kind of how you happened upon or landed on this final layout that makes it such a great work.
Oh man, I appreciate that very much. That was goal number one. This is a story that has been essentially begging to be told since before I was born. So job number one was to make sure that when somebody closed it, they were at the last page. So it had to be engaging. And I love nonfiction. I love history. I am so fascinated by 20th century history that that's kind of like where my interests lie anyway. But I'm not a dry history person. I like stories, and I like people, and I like motivation. Like what makes someone do that? I mean, that's what fascinates me. But yeah, so it was an article first. And then it was a podcast. And at that point, I'd spent a lot of time interviewing people, spent a bunch of time researching, writing, recording. And I kind of thought I was done. I had been around the loop with this story a good bit, and I wasn't sure what more I could provide. The magazine piece was pretty long. And I thought, well, I don't know, how much more is there? And then with all the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, everything that was going on in the spring of 2020, my agent reached out to me and was like, look, I know that you feel done with this, but you're sitting on this incredibly important piece of history that deserves to be told in its entirety. And, I knew that there was more to certain aspects of the story. As it turned out, I uncovered, uncovered's the wrong word. I was able to come into contact with people who I'd not yet talked to, and their stories really enriched and, filled out the larger narrative. But, when she said that to me, I said, fine, I'll do it. And so I wrote a proposal for the book, which we sold fairly quickly. And then it was a matter of getting into the research and figuring out what else was there. And also, like, what in my research had I not yet really tapped into? And there were a number of questions I had. I had questions about Nancy Caroline, and there were sort of holes in her timeline. And I knew that there was this sort of tragedy out there that I had not yet got to the bottom of. And so I researched that. And holding on to all these pieces, I wasn't exactly sure how it should look, because I think the magazine article essentially takes place in 1975 and kind of, goes back and forth to tell these stories. But, I thought this one deserved maybe a bit more of a chronological telling, because there were going to be people jumping in. There were new people that were constantly being added to the story. We'd start with John, which he just felt like, because of his trajectory of having been born in this really rough neighborhood, living in an orphanage, kind of being sucker punched by fate, but then being rescued by EMS, and what that did to his life. He felt like a very good embodiment of the spirit of Freedom House. And then, it was just a question of like, well, how do I bring these people in? And I just tried to do it organically. I just like, at what point does Peter Safran need to come in? When do we need to know who he is? And it was, after the history of EMS, we, in order to find out why we had a problem in 65, you kind of needed to know what happened before. And he's the answer. You see what has been going on through history. How is it going to be different? He's the reason it's going to be different. And then, slowly just continuing to unfold this idea of like, it's beginning to build momentum, and it's starting to draw attention, which of course brings in people from the Hill. But in order to do that, you kind of have to know a bit of who the Hill is, or what the Hill is, where the Hill is, and understand what they needed and why this thing that nobody had ever bid on before. No one had ever taken the bait on EMS. Why did these guys do it? Well, this is why. This is where they were coming from, and this is what they wanted to prove to the world. And then, it's success, and just now now they're in, and you see that it's good and that this thing is viable. But there's pushback, and so there's skepticism, and there's racism, and there are just these factors that begin to complicate the journey. And but it just keeps going and twisting and turning. And so once I had everything laid out before me, how the story should unfold became very clear. And it really was the people who nudged it in different directions along the way, which I think is the reason it reads the way it does, because the narrative is driven by these people. There's a TV writer, David Milch. He's the guy who wrote Deadwood, and he said plot is the character's emotional reaction to what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really it. It's like something happens to you, and how you react to that thing is the plot of your particular story. And so I just placed all of the forward momentum into the character's hands, and it just allowed them to sort of push it at various points.
This is your host, Christopher. If you like today's episode, give us a thumbs up and subscribe. Also, click the bell for notifications on future content. If you haven't already, check out our website, theufcshow.com, ways that you can support us and find us on other platforms. Until next time.